In 1973, one factory complex in San Francisco's Mission District employed over 3,000 workers and produced 20,000 pairs of jeans every single day. Walk down Valencia Street, peer through any high school hallway from Boston to Birmingham, and you'd see them. The instantly recognizable red tab, the copper rivets, the arcuate stitching on the back pockets. Levi's wasn't just a brand. It was what you wore, what your father wore, what his father wore before him. They had invented the category, literally patented the blueprint for blue jeans in 1873. They survived the gold rush, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and came out the other side bigger than ever. By the early 1970s, Levi Strauss and Company controlled nearly 30% of the entire American jeans market. Their Valencia Street factory was pumping out 200,000 garments per week. The company's revenue hit $2 billion annually. They were printing money by sewing denim. Then, something went catastrophically wrong. By 2003, that same Valencia Street factory sat empty. The sewing machines were gone. The workers were gone. The sound of 3,000 people making America's jeans had been replaced by silence. Levi's hadn't just closed one factory. They had systematically shut down every single manufacturing facility in the United States. Not scaled back, not downsized, completely eliminated. A company that built its reputation on American-made quality had shipped its entire production operation overseas. This is the story of how 2 immigrant brothers turned Civil War-era work pants into the most iconic garment in American history. How a family business became a global empire worth billions, and how that empire made a series of calculated decisions that destroyed its American manufacturing base, betrayed generations of workers, and transformed one of the most trusted brands in the world into just another company chasing the cheapest labor on earth. This isn't just about factories closing or jobs moving overseas. This is about what happens when a company confuses its brand with its product. When executives convince themselves that loyalty is transferable. When the people running an empire forget what actually built it. Welcome inside the Levi's factories that once defined American manufacturing, employed entire communities, and produced the jeans that clothed a nation. Where immigrant dreams were stitched into denim, and where those same dreams were ripped apart, seam by seam, in the name of quarterly profits. Butchertown, Bavaria, 1829. Levi Strauss was born into a Jewish family in a region where being Jewish meant legal restrictions on where you could live, what trades you could practice, and how much property you could own. His father was a dry goods peddler, not a merchant with a shop. A peddler, walking village to village with fabric and notions strapped to his back. It was hard work that paid almost nothing, and in 1845, when Levi was 16, his father died. 2 years later, his older brothers made a decision that would change everything. They were leaving, going to America, New York City specifically, where Jewish immigrants could actually own businesses and build something. Levi stayed behind with his mother and sisters. He was too young, and someone needed to stay. But he was watching, waiting, learning English from books, thinking about the future. In 1848, his mother died. Nothing left to stay for. Levi, his sisters Fanny and Matilda, and his brother-in-law David Stern boarded a ship bound for New York. The crossing took 68 days. When they arrived, Levi Strauss became Levi Strauss. New country, new name, new life. His brothers Jonas and Louis had established a wholesale dry goods business at 34 Maiden Lane in Lower Manhattan. J. Strauss, Brother and Company. They sold fabric, ribbons, thread, handkerchiefs, anything general stores in small towns needed to stock their shelves. Levi went to work for them immediately. He learned the business, how to buy, how to sell, how to spot what people actually wanted versus what they said they wanted. He was good at it. But New York was crowded. Every immigrant with ambition was trying to make it in the same 20 square blocks. Then, in 1848, the same year Levi arrived in America, someone found gold in California. By 1849, the gold rush was on. Tens of thousands of men flooding west. Boomtowns erupting overnight. And every single one of those men needed supplies. Tools, boots, tents, clothing. Someone had to sell it to them. In January 1853, Levi Strauss boarded another ship, this time heading to San Francisco. His brother-in-law David Stern went with him. They brought trunks full of dry goods from the New York warehouse, fabric, sewing supplies, blankets, anything they thought would sell. The journey around Cape Horn took 5 months. When they finally sailed through the Golden Gate in March 1853, San Francisco was barely recognizable as a city. Wooden buildings, dirt streets, chaos, opportunity. Levi was 24 years old. He had $5,000 in inventory, equivalent to roughly $185,000 today. He rented a space on the corner of Kearny and Sacramento streets and opened Levi Strauss Company. Not a tailor shop, not a factory, a wholesale dry goods business. He sold to the general stores and outfitters who sold to the miners. The real money wasn't in the gold fields. It was in supplying the people chasing gold. The business grew steadily. By the 1860s, Levi had expanded, moved to larger quarters at 315 to 317 Battery Street, and established himself as one of San Francisco's most respected merchants. He was known for fair dealing, quality goods, and keeping his word. In a city full of con men and overnight operators, that reputation mattered. Customers trusted him. That trust was worth more than gold. But Levi Strauss wasn't making pants yet. He was just selling fabric to people who made pants. The innovation that would create an empire didn't come from Levi at all. It came from a tailor 250 miles away who was trying to solve a problem that kept destroying his work. Reno, Nevada, 1871. Jacob Davis was a tailor with a problem that kept costing him money. He'd make a pair of work pants for a miner or a laborer, heavy canvas or denim, reinforced seams, good construction. The customer would pay, wear them for a few weeks of hard work, and then come back furious. The pockets had ripped, right at the corners where the fabric attached to the pants. Every single time. Same weak point, same failure. Davis would repair them for free, because that's what you did if you wanted to keep customers. But free repairs meant lost time and lost profit. He needed a solution. Something that would make those pocket corners strong enough to handle the stress of men loading ore, hauling timber, working 12-hour shifts in conditions that destroyed ordinary clothing. He tried heavier thread. Didn't work. Tried double stitching. Still ripped. Then one day, probably out of frustration more than genius, he looked at a horse blanket. The copper rivets holding the straps to the blanket. Those never failed. What if he put rivets at the stress points on pants? He took a pair of work pants, placed copper rivets at the pocket corners, and sold them to a customer. The man came back weeks later, not to complain, to order another pair. The rivets worked. The pockets didn't rip. Davis started making all his work pants with rivets. Word spread. Demand increased. Within months, he was selling more riveted pants than he could produce alone. But Jacob Davis had a bigger problem. He didn't have the money to patent the design, and he knew someone else would steal it the moment they figured out what he was doing. A patent cost $68, roughly $1,700 in today's money. Davis didn't have it, but he knew someone who did. Someone who already supplied him with the fabric he was using to make the pants. Someone with capital, connections, and a reputation for fair dealing. On July 5th, 1872, Jacob Davis sat down and wrote a letter to Levi Strauss in San Francisco. The letter still exists. You can read it today. Davis explained the rivet innovation, told Strauss how well the pants were selling, and made a proposal. Davis would provide the manufacturing know-how. Strauss would provide the capital for the patent. They'd split the patent rights and go into business together, making riveted work pants. Think about that for a second. A small-town tailor writing to a successful merchant he'd never met, proposing a partnership based on a clothing innovation that didn't even have a patent yet. Davis was betting everything on Strauss saying yes. If Strauss said no, or worse, if Strauss just stole the idea and filed the patent himself, Davis would have nothing. Levi Strauss said yes. On May 20th, 1873, the United States Patent Office issued patent number 139,121 to Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis for improvement in fastening pocket openings. The patent covered the use of metal rivets to reinforce stress points in work pants. It was a 17-year monopoly on what would become the fundamental construction method for blue jeans. Nobody else could legally make riveted work pants in America until 1890. Strauss moved quickly. He hired Jacob Davis, brought him to San Francisco, and set him up to oversee production. They opened their first factory at 14-16 Battery Street. Small operation, handful of seamstresses, cutting tables, sewing machines, bolts of denim fabric. The pants were called waist overalls because that's what work pants were called in the 1870s. The term jeans wouldn't become standard for decades. The product was simple: heavy denim, copper rivets at the pockets, and base of the fly. A single back pocket, suspender buttons, because belts weren't common yet. They came in one color: blue. The indigo dye was cheap, durable, and hid stains. They cost $1.46 per pair, about $36 in modern money. Expensive for work pants, but they lasted longer than anything else available. Workers noticed. Miners, railroad, workers, farmers, anyone doing physical labor started asking for them specifically. By 1880, Levi Strauss and Company was producing hundreds of pairs per day. By 1890, when the patent expired and competitors could finally make riveted pants, Levi's had a 7-year head start and a reputation for quality that competitors couldn't match. The company had gone from selling fabric to making the most durable work pants in America. Jacob Davis ran production until his death in 1908. Levi Strauss never married, never had children, but he had 4 nephews who worked in the business. When Levi died in 1902 at age 73, he left an estate worth $6 million, over $220 million today. The nephews inherited the company. The family business was now a family empire, and it was about to get much, much bigger. April 18th, 1906, 5:12 a.m. The San Francisco earthquake hit with a magnitude of 7.9. The ground shook for 45 seconds. Buildings collapsed. Gas lines ruptured. Fires started immediately and burned for 3 days. By the time the flames were extinguished, over 3,000 people were dead, and 80% of the city was destroyed. The Levi Strauss & Company headquarters and factory at 14-16 Battery Street burned to the ground, completely gone. The company had $4 million in assets, roughly $135 million in today's money. But most of those assets were inventory, equipment, and the building itself, all destroyed. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Smaller companies would have declared bankruptcy, liquidated, and disappeared. The Strauss family made a different choice. They rebuilt immediately. Not just rebuilt, expanded. They purchased land at 250 Valencia Street in the Mission District and constructed a massive new factory complex. 6 stories, 500,000 square feet, reinforced concrete and steel frame construction, designed to survive the next earthquake. The building went up in less than 2 years. By 1908, the new Valencia Street factory was operational and producing more pants than the old, Battery Street location ever had. The timing turned out to be perfect. America was about to enter the biggest economic expansion in its history, and Levi Strauss Co. was positioned to capitalize on every bit of it. The early 1900s brought mass production, assembly line efficiency, national railroad networks that could ship products anywhere. What had been a regional business serving Western workers was about to become a national brand. The company opened additional factories, a plant in El Paso, Texas in 1924 to serve the Southwest, a facility in Tennessee in the 1930s to serve the South. These weren't small operations. Each factory employed hundreds of workers, ran multiple shifts, and shipped tens of thousands of garments per week. The Valencia Street factory remained the flagship, the heart of production, but the empire was spreading. Then came the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939, a decade when most American manufacturing companies went bankrupt or were sold for parts. Unemployment hit 25%. Consumer spending collapsed. Businesses that had thrived for generations disappeared in months. Levi Strauss & Company survived. Not just survived, stayed profitable through the entire depression. How? Work pants. The product that built the company turned out to be depression-proof. When men lost their white-collar jobs and took manual labor positions, they needed durable clothing. When farmers couldn't afford to replace equipment, they needed pants that lasted years instead of months. Levi's had built a reputation for quality that paid off when quality was the only thing people could afford to care about. You bought one pair of Levi's that lasted 5 years instead of 5 pairs of cheap pants that fell apart in 1 year. The math made sense, even when money was scarce. World War II changed everything again. December 1941, the United States entered the war. The military needed uniforms. Millions of them. Levi Strauss & Company converted significant portions of its production to military contracts. They made denim work uniforms for the Navy, fatigue pants for the Army, and specialized garments for defense plant workers. The government designated denim as a strategic material. Civilian production was restricted. You couldn't just walk into a store and buy Levi's during the war. They were rationed. This created something the company hadn't anticipated. Scarcity built desire. Soldiers wore Levi's. Defense workers wore Levi's. When the war ended in 1945 and civilian production resumed, there was massive pent-up demand. Everyone wanted the pants that had clothed America through the war. The waiting lists were absurd. Stores couldn't keep them in stock. The post-war boom amplified everything. The GI Bill sent millions of men to college, but they didn't dress like their fathers had dressed. They wore jeans. Casual clothing became acceptable in ways it never had been before. Levi's wasn't just workwear anymore. It was what teenagers wore, what rebels wore, what movie stars wore. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. Marlon Brando in The Wild One, 1953, jeans and a leather jacket. Icons of American cool, and they were all wearing Levi's. The company's production exploded. The Valencia Street factory ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They hired thousands of workers, built more factories. Blackstone, Virginia in 1959. Blue Ridge, Georgia in 1961. San Antonio, Texas in 1963. Every factory employed between 1,000 and 3,000 workers. Union jobs, good wages, health insurance, pensions. These weren't just jobs. These were careers. Families worked in Levi's factories for generations. Grandmothers, mothers, daughters, all sewing the same iconic garment in the same buildings. By 1970, Levi Strauss & Company employed over 22,000 people in the United States alone. 22,000. Let that number sink in. They operated 63 manufacturing facilities across the country. The Valencia Street factory in San Francisco remained the largest and most productive. 3,500 workers, 250,000 garments per week rolling off the line. The company's annual revenue exceeded $500 million, equivalent to roughly $4 billion today. This was the peak. This was the moment when everything worked. When American manufacturing, union labor, and corporate success aligned perfectly. When a company could pay its workers well, produce a quality product, and still generate massive profits. When Made in USA wasn't a marketing slogan, it was just reality. The machinery was humming. The workers were loyal. The brand was bulletproof. Nothing could stop Levi's, or so the executives believed. But empires built on labor and quality are fragile in ways that aren't immediately visible. And the forces that would destroy this empire were already gathering strength. The early 1970s belonged to Levi's in a way that's hard to comprehend today. Walk into any American high school in 1973 and count the students wearing jeans. Wow, it's hot. Out of 10 would be Levi's. Not Wrangler, not Lee. Levi's. The company didn't just dominate the denim market. They essentially were the denim market. Market share hovered around 30%, but the cultural dominance was closer to 80%. When people said jeans, they meant Levi's. The numbers were staggering. Annual revenue hit $2 billion in 1979. The company sold over 500 million garments worldwide that year. 500 million. Production capacity in the United States alone exceeded 400,000 units per day. The factories ran constantly. Overtime was standard. Hiring was continuous. If you lived near a Levi's factory in the 1970s and you wanted a job, you could get one. Union jobs with benefits that rivaled the auto industry. The Valencia Street factory in San Francisco was the crown jewel. 6 floors of industrial production humming 24 hours a day. First shift started at 6 a.m., second shift at 2 p.m., third shift at 10 p.m. The building never slept. At peak production, 3,500 workers processed 3 million yards of denim per month. That's enough fabric to stretch from San Francisco to Chicago every month. The scale was industrial and relentless. Inside, the process was a symphony of specialized labor. The cutting room on the first floor, where massive automated cutters sliced through stacks of denim 100 layers thick. Pattern pieces moving to the sewing floor, where hundreds of operators worked individual machines. Pocket setters, belt loop attachers, fly assemblers, rivet operators. Each person doing one specific task repeatedly, efficiently, expertly. A pair of jeans passed through 35 different hands before completion. The factory wasn't making pants. It was orchestrating them. The workers were primarily women, Latina, Asian, African American, immigrant communities who had found stable employment in an industry that paid union wages and offered real advancement. You could start as a thread cutter and work your way up to floor supervisor. You could retire with a pension after 30 years and actually live on it. These jobs built the American middle class in cities across the country: San Francisco, El Paso, San Antonio, Blue Ridge, Blackstone. Factory towns where Levi's was the largest employer and the economic anchor for entire communities. The brand itself had transcended clothing. Levi's represented rebellion, independence, the American West, working class authenticity, and teenage cool all simultaneously. Counterculture kids wore them. Vietnam War protesters wore them. Conservative farmers wore them. Hippies and rednecks agreed on almost nothing except that Levi's were the correct pants. This kind of universal cultural penetration doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a product is so good and so consistent that it becomes invisible. You didn't think about buying Levi's. You just bought them. The advertising reflected this confidence. The campaigns from the 1970s didn't try to convince anyone of anything. They just showed people wearing Levi's while doing interesting things. No hard sell, no desperation, just the quiet assumption that of course you wore Levi's. What else would you wear? The arrogance was earned. The company had spent a century building trust, and that trust translated directly into market dominance. Financially, the company was a juggernaut. Gross profit margins exceeded 45%. Return on equity was over 25%. The Haas family, descendants of Levi Strauss through his nephews, controlled the company and had become one of the wealthiest families in America. They ran Levi's as a private company until 1971, then took it public and made another fortune. The IPO raised $50 million and valued the company at over $700 million. Investors were desperate to own a piece of the American denim empire. But beneath the financial dominance and cultural supremacy, something had already started to crack. Imports. Cheap foreign-made jeans flooding American stores at half the price of Levi's. In 1970, imported jeans represented less than 5% of the American market. By 1975, it was 15%. By 1980, it would be over 30%. Brands nobody had heard of 5 years earlier were suddenly everywhere, and they were cheap. A pair of Levi's cost $25 in 1978, about $120 today. Foreign knockoffs sold for $12. Levi's executives noticed. How could they not? But they weren't worried. Not yet. Knockoffs had always existed. Cheap imitations that fell apart after a few washes. Customers would come back to the real thing once they realized quality mattered. The brand was too strong. The reputation was too deep. Customers were loyal. Levi's had survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and countless competitors. Some cheap imports weren't going to change anything. This confidence wasn't stupidity. It was based on 100 years of evidence that quality won. But the executives were making a critical assumption. They assumed customers could tell the difference between a $25 pair of Levi's and a $12 pair of imports. They assumed customers cared. And they assumed that caring would translate into continued purchasing despite a significant price gap. All 3 assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. The world was shifting under their feet, and they were too successful to notice. Inside the Levi's factories, the workers had built something rare in American capitalism: real power. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, represented nearly every production employee in every Levi's facility in the United States. These weren't token unions with symbolic influence. These were serious labor organizations with contracts that guaranteed wages, benefits, working conditions, and job security that most American workers could only dream about. The contract at the Valencia Street factory was 47 pages long. Minimum wage, $8.50 per hour in 1980, equivalent to roughly $32 per hour today. Healthcare, fully covered for workers and dependents. Pension, defined benefit plan that paid 60% of final salary after 30 years of service. Vacation, 3 weeks paid after 5 years, 4 weeks after 10. Sick leave, 10 days paid annually. Job security, termination required documented cause and union approval. Overtime, time and a half for anything over 40 hours. Double time on Sundays. Read those numbers again. A sewing machine operator in San Francisco in 1980 could raise a family, own a home, send kids to college, and retire with dignity on a single income. This wasn't executive compensation. This was the factory floor. The people who actually made the jeans lived middle-class lives because the union contract forced the company to share profits with the people who generated them. The union didn't just negotiate wages, it controlled the pace of work. Management couldn't arbitrarily speed up production lines or eliminate jobs without union consent. Workers had input on safety standards, break schedules, and quality expectations. If a supervisor pushed too hard, the union steward would intervene. If quality suffered because management cut corners, workers could refuse production until standards were restored. The balance of power was real. This created something unexpected: pride. Walk through the Valencia Street factory in 1975 and talk to the workers. They weren't just clocking in for a paycheck. They believed they were making the best jeans in the world, and they were right. Quality control was obsessive. Stitching had to be perfect. Rivets had to be set exactly. Denim weight had to be consistent. If a pair didn't meet standards, it didn't ship. Workers rejected substandard materials. Managers who prioritized speed over quality got pushback from the floor. Multi-generational employment was standard. Maria Rodriguez started on the Valencia Street sewing floor in 1952. Her daughter Carmen joined in 1973. Her granddaughter Lisa in 1988. 3 generations, same factory, same company. This pattern repeated across every Levi's facility. Fathers who worked in cutting rooms watched sons join them. Mothers who set pockets trained daughters to do the same. These jobs were family legacy, and that legacy created institutional knowledge you couldn't train or replace. The company benefited enormously from this stability. Worker turnover was below 5% annually. Training costs were minimal because experienced workers mentored new hires. Quality remained high because people who planned to work somewhere for 30 years cared about maintaining standards. The union contract was expensive, but it delivered consistency that competitors couldn't match. But the world outside those factory walls was changing faster than anyone inside wanted to acknowledge. In 1979, a pair of Levi's 501s manufactured in San Francisco cost the company approximately $14 to produce. Materials, labor, overhead, everything. They sold to retailers for $18, who sold to consumers for $28. The profit margins worked because the brand commanded premium pricing and because production was efficient enough to absorb union labor. Costs. That same year, jeans manufactured in Hong Kong cost roughly $4 to produce. Materials were cheaper. Labor was drastically cheaper. Hong Kong garment workers earned 50 cents per hour, not $8.50. No union contracts, no health care, no pensions. The math was brutal and obvious. A company making jeans in Asia could undercut Levi's by 60% and still generate higher profit margins. Executives at Levi's headquarters in San Francisco were watching this unfold. They saw the import numbers rising. They saw competitors opening factories in Taiwan, South Korea, Mexico, anywhere labor was cheap and regulations were minimal. They commissioned studies, ran financial models, calculated exactly how much money the company was leaving on the table by manufacturing in the United States. The conclusion was unavoidable. Union labor in America was making Levi's uncompetitive. The company could continue paying workers $8.50 per hour plus benefits and watch market share erode, or they could do what every other apparel company was already doing: move production overseas, cut labor costs by 90%, maintain pricing, expand profit margins. The debates inside corporate headquarters were real. The Haas family, still controlling the company, believed in responsible capitalism. They valued their workers. They understood the social contract. But they also understood financial reality. Wall Street was demanding higher returns. Competitors were gaining ground. The import wave wasn't slowing down. Something had to change. In 1981, Levi's opened its first foreign production facility in the Philippines. Small operation. Just one factory. The official explanation was diversification and market access. But everyone knew what it really meant. The company was testing offshore manufacturing, seeing if they could make jeans somewhere other than America and still maintain the brand. If the test worked, more factories would follow. Many more. The union saw it immediately. This wasn't diversification. This was the beginning of the end. The ILGWU leadership filed formal complaints, demanded guarantees that domestic production wouldn't be cut, pushed for contract language protecting American jobs. Management offered reassurances. The Philippines factory was for Asian markets. Domestic production was safe. American workers had nothing to worry about. The workers didn't believe them. They'd seen this pattern before in other industries. Steel, auto, textiles. Companies always said offshoring was limited, strategic, temporary. Then one factory closed, then another. Then entire industries disappeared. The reassurances were always lies, and the workers knew it. But knowing what was coming and stopping it were two different things. The union was strong inside the factories, but powerless against global economics. You can't strike your way into competitiveness when competitors are paying workers 1/10 of your wage. The fortress the union had built was formidable, but it was surrounded by forces it couldn't fight. By the mid-1980s, the math had become impossible to ignore. Levi Strauss Co. employed over 25,000 workers in the United States, most of them union members earning wages and benefits that were generous even by American standards. The total annual labor cost for domestic production exceeded $400 million. Meanwhile, competitors who had moved manufacturing offshore were paying a fraction of that amount for the same output. The cost differential was brutal. A sewing machine operator in San Francisco earned $8.50 per hour plus benefits, bringing the total compensation to roughly $12 per hour. A sewing machine operator in the Philippines earned 50 cents per hour with no benefits. The ratio wasn't close. It was 24-1. Levi's was paying 24 times more for the exact same labor. Wall Street noticed. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions during earnings calls. Why was Levi's maintaining expensive American production when every other apparel company had already moved overseas? Why were profit margins below industry average? When would management take action to optimize the cost structure? The pressure was constant and explicit. Robert Haas, great-great-grandnephew of Levi Strauss himself, became CEO in 1984. He inherited a company that was culturally committed to American manufacturing, but financially struggling to justify it. Haas was a Harvard MBA, not a factory romantic. He understood the numbers. He also understood legacy, social responsibility, and the company's historical relationship with its workforce. The tension between these competing values would define his tenure. In 1985, Levi's made the first major decision that would eventually destroy its American manufacturing base. The company announced a global sourcing strategy. The language was careful, designed to sound responsible rather than ruthless. Levi's would maintain its American factories, but would also contract with overseas manufacturers to supplement production. This would provide flexibility, reduce costs, and allow the company to remain competitive while preserving domestic jobs. The reality was simpler. The company had decided that American workers were too expensive and overseas labor was too cheap to ignore. The global sourcing strategy was the first step in a process that would eventually eliminate every American manufacturing job at Levi's. But they couldn't say that publicly. Not yet. So they used words like supplement and flexibility and partnership instead of replacement and elimination and offshoring. The initial offshore production was modest, a few contractors in Mexico and the Caribbean. Small volumes. The jeans produced overseas weren't sold as premium products. They were marketed as budget lines, secondary brands, value offerings. The core Levi's 501s, the flagship product, were still made in America. The company maintained the fiction that location of manufacture correlated with quality tier. But the offshore production grew steadily. 10% of total volume in 1985, 15% in 1987, 20% in 1989. Each year, a larger percentage of Levi's jeans were made by foreign workers earning a fraction of what American workers earned. In each year, the company's financial performance improved. Profit margins expanded. Stock price increased. Wall Street approved. Here's what the executives understood and wouldn't say publicly. Quality didn't matter as much as they had believed. Customers couldn't actually tell the difference between jeans sewn in San Francisco and jeans sewn in Manila. The brand loyalty Levi's had spent a century building wasn't connected to American manufacturing. It was connected to the Levi's name, the red tab, the iconic status. As long as those elements remained, customers would buy the product regardless of where it was made. This realization was catastrophic for American workers because it meant their primary value proposition had evaporated. For decades, the argument for keeping production in the United States had been quality. American workers made better jeans. But if customers couldn't tell the difference, if quality was essentially equivalent, then the only variable that mattered was cost. And on cost, American workers lost. Badly. The union fought back the only way it knew how. Strikes, work stoppages, publicity campaigns. In 1987, workers at the San Antonio factory walked off the job, demanding guarantees the domestic production wouldn't be cut. The strike lasted 6 weeks. Management waited them out. The workers eventually returned under essentially the same contract, having gained nothing except unpaid time off and proof that strikes no longer carried the leverage they once had. The fundamental power dynamic had shifted. In the 1970s, when Levi's manufactured exclusively in America, a strike could shut down production and cost the company millions. In the late 1980s, when offshore contractors were producing 20% of total volume, a domestic strike was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Management could shift orders to overseas factories and maintain supply. The workers' ultimate weapon had been neutralized. Internal documents from this period, later released during lawsuits, show exactly how executives were thinking. One memo from 1988 calculated that closing a single American factory and moving its production to Mexico would save $12 million annually. Multiply that across 20 facilities, and the potential cost savings exceeded $200 million per year. The memo didn't mention the workers who would lose jobs, the communities that would be devastated, or the century-old commitment to American manufacturing. It was pure financial optimization. Another memo, this one from 1989, discussed brand positioning. The recommendation was explicit. Stop marketing Levi's as American-made. The association between the brand and domestic production was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Foreign-made jeans were cheaper to produce and equally profitable. Customers weren't demanding American manufacturing. So why limit production flexibility by maintaining that connection? Think about what that meant. The company that had built its empire on American labor was actively planning to sever the relationship between its brand and American workers. Not because the workers had failed, not because quality had declined, but because foreign labor was cheaper and customers either didn't notice or didn't care enough to pay a premium for domestic production. By 1990, offshore production had reached 30% of total volume. Levi's operated factories in Mexico, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and was exploring locations in China and Bangladesh. The company was still the largest apparel manufacturer in the United States, but the trajectory was unmistakable. Domestic production was being phased out systematically, methodically, and with increasing speed. The workers could see what was coming. The company was moving jobs overseas, cutting costs and expanding profit margins while maintaining the Levi's brand that American workers had built over 100 years. The betrayal wasn't subtle. It was explicit, documented, and defended as necessary business strategy. The executives running Levi's had made a choice. Shareholder value mattered more than worker loyalty. Quarterly earnings mattered more than century-old commitments. The math was brutal. The decision was rational, and the consequences would be devastating. January 8th, 1990. Levi Strauss Company announced the closure of its San Antonio, Texas manufacturing facility. The plant had operated for 27 years. It employed 1,115 workers. Most had been there for over a decade. Some had been there since the factory opened. The company offered severance packages, 2 weeks of pay for every year of service. Workers with 20 years got 40 weeks of severance. Then they were on their own. The official statement was corporate boilerplate. This difficult decision reflects the changing competitive dynamics of the global apparel industry. Levi's remains committed to maintaining a strong manufacturing presence in the United States, while also adapting to meet the challenges of an increasingly global marketplace. Translation: we're closing American factories and moving production to countries where workers earn 1/20th of what you earn. The San Antonio closure was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Levi's would systematically dismantle the American manufacturing infrastructure that had taken a century to build. The closures followed a pattern: announcement, worker protests, company reassurances that remaining facilities were safe. Then another announcement, another closure, another round of workers discovering that 20 years of loyalty meant nothing when the math said offshore production was cheaper. Blue Ridge, Georgia fell in 1999. The factory had employed 1,000 workers in a town of 1,200 people. When Levi's left, the town's economy collapsed. The local tax base evaporated. Schools lost funding. Main Street businesses closed. Families who had worked at the factory for 3 generations watched their children move away because there were no jobs left. This wasn't creative destruction or market evolution. This was a company abandoning a community that had built its entire economic structure around Levi's presence. Knoxville, Tennessee, closed in 2000. Powell, Tennessee, closed in 2000. Harlingen, Texas, closed in 2001. Each announcement followed the same script. Company representatives would meet with workers, explain that the closure was necessary for competitiveness, promise job placement assistance that rarely materialized, and offer severance packages that covered a few months of expenses before workers faced unemployment in local economies with no comparable jobs available. The workers' reactions were remarkably consistent across every closure. Shock, even though they had seen it coming. Anger, because the betrayal was so complete. And resignation, because they understood there was nothing they could do. The union contracts that had protected them for decades were worthless against a company determined to eliminate American manufacturing entirely. You can't negotiate with a closure. You can't strike against a shutdown. The only choice was to accept the severance and try to figure out what came next. Maria Torres had worked at the San Antonio factory for 23 years. She started in 1967 at age 19, making $2.15 per hour, which was good money for a young Latina woman in Texas. By 1990, she was earning $11.50 per hour plus benefits. She had raised 3 children on those wages, bought a house, sent her oldest daughter to community college. The job had provided stability, dignity, and a path to the middle class. When the factory closed, she was 42 years old with skills that were specific to industrial sewing and no comparable employers in San Antonio hiring. Her severance was $10,580, 46 weeks of base pay. It sounded generous until you calculated how long it would last. Mortgage, utilities, food, healthcare. 6 months, maybe 8 if she was careful. Then what? The job placement assistance Levi's promised consisted of a workshop on resume writing and a list of local employers who weren't hiring. Maria eventually found work at a retail store, making $6.50 per hour with no benefits. She lost the house 3 years later. Multiply Maria's story by 1,115 workers in San Antonio alone, then by tens of thousands of workers across every Levi's facility that closed in the 1990s, and you begin to understand the human cost of offshoring. These weren't abstract efficiency gains. These were families destroyed, communities hollowed out, and lives disrupted because executives in San Francisco had determined that paying American workers was no longer financially optimal. The company's financial performance during this period tells the other side of the story. As American factories closed and production moved overseas, Levi's profit margins expanded dramatically. In 1990, gross profit margin was 38%. By 2000, it had reached 48%. The cost savings from offshore manufacturing were enormous and flowed directly to the bottom line. Earnings per share increased 65% during the decade. The Haas family, still controlling the company, saw their net worth multiply. In 1996, the family took the company private again through a leveraged buyout valued at $3.3 billion. They borrowed money to buy out public shareholders, citing a desire for long-term strategic flexibility without quarterly earnings pressure. The real reason was simpler. Going private meant they could accelerate factory closures without facing immediate public market scrutiny. The LBO was essentially a mechanism to complete the offshoring process without Wall Street analysts questioning every decision. The pace of closures accelerated immediately. Between 1997 and 2003, Levi's closed more than 30 American manufacturing facilities, every single one. The plants in El Paso, Amarillo, Harlingen, the facilities in Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia. One by one, they shut down. Machines were sold or scrapped. Buildings were abandoned or sold. Workers were terminated. The entire American manufacturing infrastructure was systematically eliminated. Here's what makes this particularly brutal. The closures had nothing to do with product quality or worker performance. American factories were still producing excellent jeans. Productivity was high. Quality control was excellent. Customer satisfaction wasn't declining. The workers weren't failing. They were just too expensive compared to overseas alternatives. That was the only variable that mattered. The company tried to soften the message with promises that Levi's would always maintain some American presence, that certain facilities were strategic and wouldn't close, that the brand's American heritage remained important. Every promise was broken. Every reassurance was a lie. The strategy was total elimination of domestic manufacturing, and management executed it without hesitation or deviation. By 2002, only 2 facilities remained operational in the United States. The Valencia Street factory in San Francisco and a small plant in San Antonio that had avoided the first round of closures. These weren't exceptions to the strategy. They were the last items on the closure list. Their continued operation was temporary, a brief delay before the inevitable final shutdown. Everyone knew what was coming. The only question was when. The Valencia Street factory workers watched sister facilities close year after year and understood their turn was approaching. They had survived longer than most, probably because closing the flagship factory where the company was founded would generate significant negative publicity. But survival wasn't victory. It was just a slower death. The machinery was old. Investment in maintenance had stopped. New equipment wasn't being installed. The company was letting the factory deteriorate deliberately, making the eventual closure easier to justify. The workers kept showing up, kept making jeans, kept maintaining standards that management no longer cared about. What else could they do? They needed the paychecks until the end came. But the pride was gone. They were making a product for a company that had already decided their work didn't matter. The Valencia Street factory was still operational in 2002, but it was already dead. The company had killed it years earlier. They just hadn't made the announcement yet. September 25th, 2002. The announcement came in the morning. Levi Strauss Company would close its remaining manufacturing facilities in San Antonio and San Francisco. All production would be moved overseas. The company would no longer make jeans in the United States. After 150 years of American manufacturing, Levi's was eliminating every single domestic production job. The decision was final. No negotiations, no compromises, just termination. The Valencia Street factory in San Francisco was the symbolic heart of the closure. 6 stories, 500,000 square feet, 97 years of continuous operation since its construction in 1906. 3 generations of workers who had sewn tens of millions of pairs of jeans inside those walls. The building wasn't just a factory, it was a monument to American industrial manufacturing, union labor, and the belief that companies had obligations to communities beyond quarterly earnings. The closure would eliminate 850 jobs in San Francisco alone, 550 in San Antonio. Combined with the plant closures over the previous decade, Levi's had eliminated over 15,000 American manufacturing jobs in less than 15 years. Let that number sink in. 15,000 people who had worked for Levi's, many for decades, who were terminated because the company decided foreign labor was cheaper. The reaction in San Francisco was immediate and furious. Union representatives called press, conferences. Workers organized protests outside the factory. City officials condemned the decision. Local newspapers ran stories about families who had worked at Valencia Street for 3 generations, all losing their jobs simultaneously. The mayor called it a betrayal of the workers who made Levi's what it is. The company's response was corporate indifference wrapped in sympathetic language. Phil Marino, Levi's CEO at the time, released a statement. "This is one of the most difficult decisions we have ever had to make. However, the increasingly competitive global market and the continued economic downturn make these closures necessary." The statement didn't mention that Levi's profit margins were at record highs. Didn't mention that offshore production was generating cost savings that went directly to shareholder value. Just vague references to competition and economic conditions, as if the closures were forced by external circumstances rather than deliberate strategic choice. Inside the Valencia Street factory, workers were processing the news. Rosa Hernandez had worked there for 34 years. She started in 1968 at age 18, making $2.85 per hour. By 2002, she was earning $16.50 per hour with full benefits. She had raised 4 children on those wages, bought a house in the Mission District in 1975 for $45,000 that was now worth over $600,000. The job had provided everything: stability, security, dignity. And now it was ending. Her severance would be 68 weeks of pay. $21,420 total. It sounded substantial until you calculated expenses. Mortgage, utilities, healthcare now that she'd lose insurance, property taxes that had skyrocketed as San Francisco gentrified. 6 months, maybe 8. Then she'd need to find new work at age 52 with skills that only mattered in an industry that no longer existed in America. Retail jobs paid $8 per hour. Office jobs required computer skills she didn't have. The math was brutal. She wasn't alone. Walk through the Valencia Street factory in October 2002 and talk to the workers. Same story repeated 850 times. 20 years with the company. 30 years. 40 years. Multi-generational families where grandmothers, mothers, and daughters all worked the same floor. People who had believed, genuinely believed, that loyalty mattered, that good work was rewarded, that companies had obligations beyond profit maximization. The closure destroyed that belief completely. The company offered job placement assistance. workshops on resume writing, interview skills, job searching, nice gestures, utterly useless for workers whose entire skill set was industrial sewing. There were no comparable manufacturing jobs in San Francisco. The tech industry didn't hire 50-year-old seamstresses. Retail and service jobs paid half what they'd been earning and offered no benefits. The assistance was performative, designed to make the company look responsible, while doing nothing to address the fundamental problem that 850 skilled workers had been made obsolete by a business decision. Production continued through the closure period. The company needed to maintain supply while transitioning contracts to overseas factories. So workers kept showing up, kept sewing jeans, kept maintaining the quality standards that management had decided no longer justified American wages. The absurdity was conscious. They were training their replacements, teaching overseas contractors the techniques that would be used to eliminate their jobs permanently. Some workers refused, walked off the floor, said they wouldn't participate in their own obsolescence. The company didn't argue, just processed their terminations early and hired temporary workers to fill the gap. The message was clear. Individual resistance was meaningless. The decision had been made at a level where worker input didn't matter and couldn't change outcomes. The final production run was scheduled for November 2003. 14 months from announcement to closure. During that period, the factory produced its last 3.2 million garments. Levi's 501s, 505s, 550s. Every pair stamped with Made in USA labels that were about to become historical artifacts. After November 2003, those labels would disappear from new Levi's products entirely. The company that had invented American blue jeans would no longer make them in America. On the last day, November 7th, 2003, about 200 workers showed up. Not the full shift. Many had already found other employment and left early. But the core remained. The people who had given decades to the company and wanted to be there when it ended. They sewed the final pairs, watched the last garments roll off the line. Then the machine stopped. The silence was immediate and absolute. For 97 years, the Valencia Street factory had operated 24 hours a day. The sound of industrial sewing machines, cutting equipment, material handlers moving fabric, workers talking, supervisors calling out instructions, constant, relentless activity. Now, nothing. The machines were off. The workers were leaving. The building was empty. Some workers cried. Others were angry. Most were just numb. They collected their final paychecks, their severance paperwork, their termination notices, walked out of the building for the last time. The company held no ceremony, offered no formal goodbye, made no acknowledgement that something historically significant had just ended. The closure was processed as administrative paperwork, not as the death of American manufacturing. Rosa Hernandez was one of the last to leave. She walked through the empty sewing floor one final time. 6 floors, all silent. The cutting tables where she had started 34 years earlier. The sewing stations where she had spent 3 decades, the break rooms where she had eaten lunch with friends who were now scattered, looking for work in an economy that had no place for them. She didn't say goodbye, just turned off the lights and walked out. The building stood empty after that. Levi's retained ownership, but made no effort to repurpose or sell it. The machinery was removed gradually, some sold to overseas factories, some scrapped for parts. The building itself was too large and too old to attract buyers. It sat vacant for years, a physical monument to corporate abandonment. The company that had built its empire there had simply walked away, leaving the shell behind like a discarded garment that no longer fit. 150 years from Levi Strauss arriving in America with nothing to Levi Strauss and Company, closing its last American factory and eliminating every domestic manufacturing job. The company survived, thrived even. Revenue continued growing. Profit margins expanded. The brand remained iconic. But the workers who had made that success possible were gone, and the communities that had depended on Levi's were left to figure out what came next without the company that had been their economic anchor for generations. The transition was faster than anyone expected. In 2003, Levi's closed its last American factories. By 2004, the company was producing jeans in over 50 countries across 4 continents: China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia. The list kept expanding. Wherever labor was cheapest and regulations were minimal, Levi's opened production contracts. The cost savings were exactly what the financial models had predicted. A sewing machine operator in Bangladesh earned 35 cents per hour. No health insurance, no pension, no job security, no union representation. The total cost to produce a pair of Levi's 501s in Dhaka was approximately $3.50, including materials, labor, overhead, and shipping back to the United States. The same pair had cost $14 to produce in San Francisco. Levi's didn't lower prices. A pair of 501s that sold for $48 in 2003, when they were made in America, sold for $52 in 2005, when they were made in Bangladesh. The company pocketed the cost savings as increased profit margin. Gross profit margin jumped from 48% to 54% in 2 years. The quarterly earnings reports showed exactly where the savings went. Not to customers, not to workers, to shareholders. The marketing pivoted immediately. References to American manufacturing disappeared from advertising. The quality never goes out of style. Campaign was replaced with Live Unbuttoned, emphasizing youth culture and global lifestyle rather than heritage or craftsmanship. The company's website removed historical content about the Valencia Street factory. Press releases stopped mentioning manufacturing location entirely. Levi's became, in corporate language, a global brand with worldwide reach. But customers noticed. The online forums, the Reddit threads, the product reviews started showing a consistent pattern. These aren't the same. Quality has gone down. They don't fit like they used to. My old Levi's lasted 10 years. These fell apart in 6 months. The complaints were subjective and impossible to quantify definitively, but they were persistent and widespread. Some of it was perception. People believed American-made was better, so they convinced themselves that foreign-made was worse. But some of it was real. The offshore factories didn't have the institutional knowledge, the multi-generational expertise, or the quality culture that American workers had built over decades. A seamstress in San Francisco, who had been setting pockets for 30 years, could spot quality issues that a new worker in Cambodia couldn't. That accumulated expertise mattered, and losing it had consequences. The stitching was less consistent. The denim weight varied more between batches. The fit changed subtly as different factories used slightly different patterns. The rivets were sometimes set incorrectly. Small things. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that longtime Levi's customers could feel the difference. The jeans weren't bad. They just weren't as good. And for a premium brand charging premium prices, not as good was a problem. Levi's responded to complaints with denials. Quality standards were the same, regardless of manufacturing location. The company maintained strict oversight of all contractors. Any issues were isolated incidents, not systemic problems. The official line was that location didn't matter, quality was universal, and customer satisfaction remained high. The data suggested otherwise. Return rates increased 15% between 2004 and 2006. Warranty claims for manufacturing defects rose 22%. Customer satisfaction scores in independent surveys dropped from 87% to 78%. The brand loyalty that Levi's had spent 150 years building was eroding, not catastrophically, but measurably. Customers who had worn Levi's exclusively for decades started trying other brands. Some came back, many didn't. The company's response was to cut prices slightly and increase marketing spending. If the product wasn't compelling enough, on quality alone, make it compelling on price and brand awareness. Flood the market with advertisements, sponsor events, partner with celebrities. Remind people that Levi's was iconic, even if the actual jeans were now indistinguishable from cheaper competitors. Meanwhile, the workers who had made those jeans for generations were discovering what came after Levi's. Rosa Hernandez, 34 years with the company, found work at Target stocking shelves for $9.50 per hour. No benefits, no pension, no union. She worked there for 3 years until her back gave out from the constant lifting. Then, she went on disability. Maria Torres from the San Antonio factory became a home healthcare aide. $8 per hour, helping elderly people bathe, dress, and eat. Difficult, intimate work that paid less than half what she had earned sewing jeans. She worked into her 60s because Social Security alone wasn't enough to live on, and the pension she had been promised through Levi's union contract had been drastically reduced when the company restructured its retirement obligations during bankruptcy proceedings in the 1990s. Carmen Rodriguez, Maria's daughter from the opening of this script, lost her job when Valencia Street closed. She was 29 years old with a 2-year-old son and limited education beyond high school. She found work at a call center making $11 per hour. The job lasted 8 months before the call center outsourced to the Philippines. She eventually became a bartender. Different industry, different skills, different life than she had planned when she followed her mother and grandmother into the Levi's factory. Multiply these stories across 15,000 workers terminated between 1990 and 2003, and the human cost becomes visible. These weren't abstract efficiency gains or optimization strategies. These were lives disrupted, families stressed, communities hollowed out. The workers didn't fail. They were making excellent jeans right up until the day the factories closed. They were just in the way of profit maximization. The communities that had hosted Levi's factories struggled. Blue Ridge, Georgia never recovered from the 1999 closure. The town's population declined 20% over the next decade as young people left for employment elsewhere. The school system lost funding. Property values collapsed. The tax base evaporated. The town still exists, but it's a shadow of what it was when Levi's employed 1,000 people. San Francisco's Mission District, where the Valencia Street factory had operated for 97 years, gentrified rapidly after the closure. The workers who lost their jobs couldn't afford to stay in neighborhoods where tech industry salaries drove rents to absurd levels. They moved to outer neighborhoods or left the city entirely. The Mission transformed from a working-class Latino community into expensive lofts and artisanal coffee shops. The factory building itself was eventually converted to office space, rented to tech startups at rates no manufacturing operation could ever justify. By 2010, Levi Strauss Co. was producing over 400 million garments annually in factories spanning 6 continents. 0 were made in the United States. The company employed over 16,000 people worldwide, but only about 200 were production workers, all of them overseas contractors who earned a fraction of what American workers had earned. The transformation was complete. The company that had been synonymous with American manufacturing had become just another global corporation, chasing cheap labor wherever it could be found. The executives who made these decisions were promoted, not punished. Phil Marino, who oversaw the final closures, left Levi's in 2006 with a compensation package reportedly worth over $20 million. The board thanked him for successfully restructuring the company's cost base and improving profit margins. The workers got severance packages and job placement workshops. The executives got golden parachutes and glowing Performance reviews. The strategy worked from a financial perspective. Levi's remained profitable. The brand survived. Revenue continued growing. The company went public again in 2019, raising $587 million in an IPO that valued the company at $6.6 billion. Wall Street celebrated the offering. Investors praised management for successfully navigating global competition. Nobody mentioned the 15,000 American workers who had been eliminated to make those profits possible. This is capitalism in its purest form. Maximize profit, minimize cost, externalize consequences. The workers who suffered weren't stakeholders who mattered in corporate strategy. They were line items on a spreadsheet, and when the math said offshore production was cheaper, they were eliminated. The communities that depended on those jobs weren't factors in the decision. The brand loyalty built over 150 years of American manufacturing wasn't worth protecting if foreign-made jeans sold just as well at higher margins. Levi's made a calculated bet. They bet that customers cared more about the brand than the manufacturing location. They bet that quality differences would be minimal and acceptable. They bet that the cost savings from offshore production would more than compensate for any loss of brand equity or customer loyalty. And they were right. The bet paid off. The company thrived. The workers paid the price. Drive down Valencia Street in San Francisco today, and you'll pass 250 Valencia Street without noticing anything unusual. The building is still there. 6 stories of reinforced concrete and steel, exactly as it was constructed in 1906. The bones are solid. The structure survived earthquakes, economic depressions, world wars, and nearly a century of industrial production. But the purpose is gone. The building was converted to office space in 2013, a decade after the factory closed. The sewing floors were gutted. The industrial equipment was removed. The loading docks were sealed. The freight. Elevators were replaced with modern passenger lifts. What had been a temple of American manufacturing became generic office space for tech startups and creative agencies. The transformation was architectural erasure. Every trace of what the building had been was deliberately eliminated. Walk inside today, and you'll find open floor plans, exposed brick, reclaimed wood accents, and Herman Miller chairs. Young professionals typing on MacBooks, where seamstresses once operated industrial sewing machines. Conference rooms where cutting tables once processed miles of denim daily. A coffee bar where the foreman's office used to coordinate 3 shifts of production. The space is bright, modern, desirable, and completely disconnected from the building's history. There's no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement that this building was the heart of American denim production for 97 years. No mention of the 3,500 workers who spent their careers here. No recognition that generations of families earned middle-class lives inside these walls. The building's past has been aestheticized into industrial character that adds value for current tenants who have no idea what industrious actually occurred here. The rent is $65 per square foot annually. For the full building, that's over $30 million per year. No manufacturing operation could justify that cost. The financialization of urban real estate made industrial production economically impossible, even if Levi's had wanted to maintain American manufacturing. The math stopped working decades ago, but the building's conversion makes the obsolescence visible. Production has been replaced by emails and meetings and strategic planning sessions that create no physical products whatsoever. The workers who made jeans here are scattered. Some still live in San Francisco, barely. They're in their 60s and 70s now, living in rent-controlled apartments or outer neighborhoods where prices haven't completely exploded. Others left the city entirely, pushed out by rising costs they couldn't afford on retail wages or disability payments. The community that existed on and around the factory floor doesn't exist anymore. It was displaced by economic forces that had no room for industrial workers in a city that had decided its future was technology, finance, and services. Rosa Hernandez still lives in the Mission, in the house she bought in 1975 for $45,000. It's worth over $1.4 million now. She's property rich and cash poor, surviving on Social Security and the reduced pension from Levi's that pays about $800 per month. She drives past the old factory sometimes, doesn't stop, doesn't go inside. What would be the point? The building that defined her life for 34 years is now occupied by people who wouldn't recognize her and couldn't understand what she lost when it closed. The other factories that Levi's closed met different fates. The Blue Ridge, Georgia facility was demolished. The land was sold to a developer who built a shopping center. The San Antonio plant became a warehouse for a logistics company. The Knoxville factory was converted to artist studios and cheap apartments. None became manufacturing facilities again. That use was obsolete. The equipment was gone, and no company was interested in reviving American garment production at wages that could support workers. What about the jeans themselves? Levi's still sells hundreds of millions of pairs annually. Revenue in 2023 exceeded $6.2 billion. The brand remains iconic. Walk through any mall, any department store, any online retailer, and Levi's are prominently displayed. The red tab is still instantly recognizable. The style numbers 501, 505, 550 are still cultural references. The product survived the elimination of American manufacturing completely intact. But the complaints persist. Online reviews are filled with customers noting that quality has declined. Not like they used to be. Fall apart after a year. Sizing is inconsistent. Cheap materials. The company disputes these characterizations, maintains that quality standards are rigorously enforced, and points to customer satisfaction data that shows most buyers are happy. But the vocal minority who remember when Levi's were made in America and lasted a decade swear the product has degraded. The truth is probably somewhere between perception and reality. Some of the quality concerns are nostalgia and confirmation bias. People want to believe American-made was better, so they interpret any defect as proof. But some of the concerns are legitimate. The institutional knowledge that existed in American factories, the expertise that came from workers who spent careers perfecting their craft, that's gone. And replacing it with rotating contractors in developing countries inevitably creates quality variation that didn't exist when production was consolidated in facilities that operated for decades. Levi's response has been to compete on price rather than quality. The jeans are cheaper now, in real dollar terms, than they were in the 1970s. A pair of 501s costs about $70 today. Adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to about $20 in 1975 dollars. The jeans that cost $25 back then, roughly $120 in today's money, are now significantly cheaper. The company made a choice. Lower production costs through offshoring, maintain pricing at levels that feel premium but aren't actually expensive, and accept that quality might be slightly lower but still acceptable to most customers. It worked. The business model is profitable. The brand is healthy. The company continues growing, but something was lost that can't be quantified in quarterly earnings reports or market share data. Trust. The belief that Levi's represented something more than just another clothing brand chasing margins. The connection between the product and the people who made it. The idea that a company had obligations beyond shareholders. For 150 years, Levi Strauss Co. was an American company in more than just legal incorporation. It employed Americans, paid American wages, contributed to American communities, built a product that was synonymous with American quality and American identity. When the company closed its last factory in 2003, it didn't just eliminate jobs. It severed the connection between the brand and the values that had made the brand meaningful. The executives would argue this was necessary. Global competition forced the decision. Maintaining American manufacturing would have made the company uncompetitive and eventually killed it entirely. Better to offshore production, stay profitable, and preserve the brand than cling to nostalgic notions of manufacturing location and watch the company collapse. The logic is defensible. The consequences were brutal anyway. Today, Levi Strauss Co. is headquartered in San Francisco, 2 miles from the shuttered factory that once defined the company. The corporate offices are in Levi's Plaza, a campus built in 1982 that houses executives, designers, marketers, and strategists. About 1,000 people work there. None of them make jeans. The company employs 19,000 people globally. Fewer than 500 are production workers, all overseas contractors earning wages that would have been considered exploitation in America. The company still calls itself American, still markets the brand as representing American values, still uses imagery of the American West, American rebels, American workers in its advertising. But the actual Americans who made the product, who built the brand, who turned Levi Strauss's vision into a global empire, they're gone, retired, displaced, working different jobs for lower wages, or dead. The brand survived. The workers didn't. That's the trade. That's what offshoring means in human terms. Shareholders win, executives win, customers get cheaper products, and the workers who made the products, who depended on the jobs, who believed the company valued their contributions, they get severance packages and job placement assistance, and the knowledge that their decades of loyalty meant nothing when the financial calculations said foreign labor was cheaper. So what went wrong? How does a company that dominated American denim for a century, that employed tens of thousands of workers, that built multi-generational loyalty and iconic brand recognition, end up eliminating every single American manufacturing job in pursuit of profit margins? The answer isn't simple, but it's instructive. Lesson 1. Brand equity and manufacturing base are not the same thing. Levi's executives believed the brand was so strong that manufacturing location didn't matter. They were partially right. The brand survived offshoring completely. Customers continued buying Levi's made in Bangladesh at the same rates they bought Levi's made in San Francisco. The red tab, the style numbers, the cultural associations, those remained powerful regardless of where the jeans were sewn. But what the executives missed was the subtle erosion that happened beneath brand awareness. Quality perception declined. Customer loyalty weakened. The connection between the product and American identity loosened. These changes weren't catastrophic. They were gradual, difficult to measure, and easy to dismiss as insignificant. But they accumulated. The brand that had been unassailable in 1980 was just another clothing option by 2010. Still successful, still profitable, but no longer special. The company traded manufacturing integrity for short-term profit optimization and didn't realize what they were giving up until it was too late to recover. Once institutional knowledge was eliminated, once multi-generational expertise was destroyed, once the connection between workers and product was severed, it couldn't be rebuilt. The executives thought they were making a reversible business decision. They were actually burning bridges they would never be able to reconstruct. Lesson 2. Labor is an investment, not just a cost. The financial models that justified offshoring treated workers as interchangeable units of production. A sewing machine operator in San Francisco and a sewing machine operator in Dhaka performed the same function, so the only relevant variable was cost. Pay less, increase margins. Simple math. But workers aren't interchangeable. The seamstress in San Francisco, who had been setting pockets for 30 years, possessed knowledge that couldn't be transferred to a manual or taught in a training session. She knew how denim behaved under different tensions. She could spot quality issues by feel. She understood the relationship between stitch tension and long-term durability. That expertise was the product of decades of experience and couldn't be replicated by hiring cheaper workers overseas. When Levi's eliminated American manufacturing, they eliminated that expertise. The cost savings were immediate and quantifiable. The quality loss was gradual and difficult to attribute to any specific decision. But customers noticed. The jeans weren't as good. And once a brand loses its quality reputation, getting it back is nearly impossible. Levi's saved billions in labor costs and lost something more valuable that they couldn't measure on a balance sheet. Lesson 3. Short-term profit versus long-term trust. Every quarter, Levi's executives reported to Wall Street. Analysts asked about profit margins, cost optimization, competitive positioning. Nobody asked about worker loyalty or community relationships or the company's obligations to people who had spent careers building the brand. The incentive structure rewarded executives who cut costs and increased quarterly earnings. It penalized executives who invested in workers, maintained expensive manufacturing, or prioritized long-term stability over short-term gains. This created a system where the rational decision, the decision that would be rewarded and praised, was to offshore production, regardless of human cost. Any executive who argued for maintaining American manufacturing would be labeled naive, sentimental, or incompetent. The financial logic was overwhelming. Cut costs, increase margins, boost stock price, get promoted. The workers were never part of the equation because the metrics that mattered to Wall Street didn't include worker welfare. The result was predictable. Levi's became more profitable by every financial measure while betraying the workers and communities that had built the company. The executives who made these decisions were compensated richly. The workers who suffered the consequences received severance packages and corporate sympathy that meant nothing when their jobs disappeared. Trust takes generations to build and quarters to destroy. Levi's spent 150 years building trust with workers, customers, and communities. They destroyed that trust in less than 2 decades by demonstrating that loyalty was one-directional. The company expected workers to be loyal, to work hard, to maintain quality, to represent the brand with pride. But when financial calculations said those workers were too expensive, the company terminated them without hesitation. The workers learned, too late, that their loyalty was not reciprocated. Lesson 4. Made in America meant something, not just symbolically, not just as marketing language. It meant product quality backed by worker expertise. It meant jobs that paid enough to support families and build communities. It meant companies had obligations beyond shareholder returns. It meant American industrial capacity mattered for reasons beyond profit optimization. When Levi's eliminated American manufacturing, they contributed to a broader collapse of domestic industrial production. They demonstrated to every other American company that offshoring was not just acceptable, but financially optimal. They validated the idea that worker welfare was less important than profit margins. They helped normalize the wholesale elimination of American manufacturing jobs in pursuit of cheaper labor overseas. The consequences extended far beyond Levi's. Entire industries followed the same path. Textiles, electronics, furniture, tools, anything that could be made cheaper overseas was moved. American manufacturing employment collapsed from 19 million workers in 1980 to 12 million in 2020. That decline wasn't inevitable. It was the result of thousands of decisions by thousands of companies, each making the same rational calculation that Levi's made. Pay workers less, increase margins, accept no responsibility for the communities and workers left behind. Levi's wasn't uniquely evil. They were following standard business practice. But standard business practice destroyed the American working class, hollowed out communities, and transferred wealth from workers to shareholders on a scale that has destabilized the entire economy. The company that Levi Strauss built had been part of an industrial system that created broadly shared prosperity. The company that his descendants ran became part of a financial system that concentrates wealth and externalizes costs. The final lesson is the simplest and most brutal. No company is too big, too iconic, or too historically significant to betray its workers when the financial incentives say that betrayal is profitable. Levi's had every reason to maintain American manufacturing, historical legacy, brand identity, worker loyalty, community relationships, a century of success built on domestic production. None of it mattered when the spreadsheet said offshore manufacturing would increase profit margins by 10 percentage points. If Levi's, the company that literally invented blue jeans and built its reputation on American quality, couldn't justify paying American workers, then no company can. The message is clear. Workers are expendable. Communities are expendable. Historical relationships are expendable. The only thing that matters is quarterly earnings and shareholder returns. Everything else is sentiment, and sentiment doesn't show up on balance sheets. This is the legacy of American deindustrialization in microcosm. A company built by immigrants and workers, powered by union labor and quality craftsmanship, transformed into a global brand that manufactures nothing in America and employs almost no American production workers. The brand survived. The profits increased. The executives were rewarded. And the workers who made it all possible were discarded like defective merchandise that no longer served its purpose. Levi Strauss came to America with nothing and built an empire. His descendants inherited that empire and dismantled the American foundation that made it possible. 150 years from immigrant entrepreneur to global corporation that has completely severed the connection between its product and the country that made it iconic. The jeans are still called Levi's. They're just not American anymore. Not in any way that matters. Every company that thinks it can offshore production without consequence should study Levi's. Every executive who believes brand loyalty is independent of manufacturing integrity should walk through that empty Valencia Street building. Every shareholder who prioritizes quarterly earnings over long-term stability should talk to the workers who gave decades to a company that discarded them when cheaper alternatives became available. What other corporations do you see making the same mistakes today? Let me know in the comments below. If you want more stories of American industrial rise and fall, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.